Welcome to the third and final installment of my interview with Brian Thomas, owner of the Thomas Law Group and writer of the blog You're Doubting Thomas. Also, welcome to my dining room. Throughout this series, we've been discussing two of Brian's blog posts. If you say I'm not a racist, I have a black friend, read this, and to some, I'm just an N-word in a stolen car. Today, I asked Brian if it's fair of white people to ask a certain question of black people. And Brian shares his thoughts on where we're going from here. I feel like the question, what can I do to help? When I ask a black person that, or when any white person asks a black person that, what can I do to help to fight systemic racism? I feel like that can be an unfair question because it puts the burden on that black person who's already the target of racism to tell me what to do. It's like another thing to put on someone's plate. How do you feel about that question?
I don't think it's an unfair question. However, I do agree with you. I mean, I think what we ultimately can do is what we're doing today, and that's having the conversation, right? I think in the last month, really, there's been more of an acknowledgement that systemic racism exists than ever in my lifetime, right? At any point in my lifetime. So just having the acknowledgement, that's where we begin, because 30 years ago, 31 years ago, or 29, 30 years ago, Rodney King got pulled over and beaten in, I think it was Los Angeles County. Mm-hmm. And we all saw that on video, right? But then there's, victim blaming, he's high on PCP, he deserved it, he's black, all these other elements that went in. And, there wasn't really an acknowledgement of the difference between how I may be policed versus you, right? For nothing, and the only difference being the color of our skin, right? And I think there's more of an acknowledgement, and there certainly is a willingness to listen, that 20 years ago, my parents could have had the same exact income, same exact credit score, and won't get the same mortgage as you, right? And I mean, there's arguments that are made that I read something in, having to do with the reparations fight in Evanston, that's true today, right? Which shocks me, frankly, to be quite honest. But that's not something that I really research or look into day in and day out. But there is some evidence that is still true today. That and I know that that's true when I walk in and go look at a car, right? I mean, I'm going to get a salesman that doesn't believe that they're going to steer me into the cheapest car on the lot. And not that I'm there for the most expensive, but there's this certain thought that if I'm not an athlete, then what am I doing there, right? And when I walk around, I'm 5'7". I don't look like an athlete. So, and again, going back, David, I mean, we're talking about conditioning, and I remember writing something a while ago about seeing an African-American male in a Maserati, and I initially craned my neck because I was like, oh, that must be an athlete. And then, in my head, I said, that's ridiculous. He's just another guy like you who's done well with his brain. Right, but my conditioning says African-American male, nice car, must be an athlete, right? Or at least it did on that day.
Right, and I believe it's in your latest post where you discuss, right, going into the Lexus dealership and being the recipient of a microaggression. So when that happens, like when it happened in that example, how do you react?
Eye rolls.
Yeah.
Typically, I react with an eye roll because there's a lot of irony going on. To me, there's a lot of irony, and I just remind myself that that fortunately, with a lot of hard work that didn't begin with me, it really began with my parents and their parents. That I'm in a position where I can be in that dealership and I belong in that dealership, and I need to, and that I can afford a car from that dealership. So that's kind of where I go in my head, as opposed to anger, because anger doesn't ultimately help, I don't think. So, but it does happen, right? And like that happened where I was just looking at a poster with respect to financing, or like a big cardboard cutout, 2.9% financing, and a guy comes up to me and kind of explains the type of car that it's for. I think it was for new cars or something like that. But then he said, but you probably don't have the credit to qualify, and walked away. And, again, of course, the initial reaction was anger, but then I rolled my eyes and then went and tried to find the car I wanted to purchase, because, that's the society in which we live, unfortunately, that's not the first time, and nor was it the last time that something like that has happened to me.
Recognizing bias against Black people is a theme in your posts. And so, and you note that this is the first and most critical step. Then you advise that we talk to our children. Now, I know I'm about to ask the very question that I just deemed unfair, but I never said I wasn't a hypocrite. What comes next, right? After we talk to our children, what's the next step?
You know what? I was thinking about that this morning, and I might want to revise my answer. And I think really listening to our children may be more important rather than talking to them, because when we talk to our children, we give them our biases. Like we'll let them know our bias and our conditioning when we teach them, because that's the way we were raised. Whereas if we listen to our children a little bit more, we'll see the world without the color of our own bias. So, for example, my children don't flinch if they see two women getting married. It's just two women getting married, or two women as a couple. It's not a big deal to them at all. And not that my wife or I flinch, but it's just not the way that wasn't normal in 1980, where two women were getting married. So, so listening and maybe seeing the world from their eyes, I think, is more important than really talking to them. But I think also another thing that we can do is, when someone in our neighborhood sends out a text and says someone's out of context, maybe politely asking what they mean by that, calling that out, calling out those biases, so that that person then needs to think about what their knee-jerk reaction was and the cause of it.
In the same post, you say, I felt pride about our neighbors, our many friends, and the life we've built in Northbrook, and the foundation we laid before moving here. We're just the Thomas house. I felt pride and still do about the direction this country is moving. We're going the right way. I feel it in my community. I feel it daily. That post was written back in July of 2016. Would you write that same thing today?
Absolutely. I feel that way. After George Floyd was murdered, I was angry, and I sat. We have like this outdoor space in the backyard, and I basically sat looking at the trees for 2 days. and I'm even looking at my wife kind of side-eyed. I'm just like kind of angry, and that's the way I really kind of process things. And I was processing that anger. And I know Amy was having conversations with people in the neighborhood, and they were just surprised by my feelings and how I feel about my Blackness, how, it kind of enters before I do into a room, because they don't see me that way. So, I do have good neighbors, right? And I think many of the people listening to this, the vast majority of us are good people. Again, I think that there's just biases that we're not necessarily conscious of. And I think the conversation that we're having today will then shine a light on those biases. And that's the question that we can be asking each other individually and as a community is, where does my bias lead me to do something that maybe I shouldn't be doing? right? I mean, for example, this is my, again, something that I was taught and or conditioned to do. And that is, I'm having a conversation a couple weeks ago with a teacher from New Trier, and we were talking about how the fall was going to look in school. And that led to, us talking about who's actually going to, where are those constructs going to be built from? Is it going to be built from people on the North Shore, or is it going to be built from people in Inglewood? And I said, look, I don't know how comfortable I feel with people who don't care about providing their children with an education, and us kind of building a system around them. And he stopped me and said, well, sometimes if you're working overnight shifts, if you are working 2 jobs, if there's 5 people in a home, in a 2-bedroom home, and money's scarce, it's a little bit more difficult for those parents to sit with their children and help them learn, because they are at work or they're doing other things to keep that roof over their head and keep electricity and keep that apartment warm. So that moment I was stopped in my privilege, and I needed to re-examine my own thoughts, where I was wrong, and acknowledge that I was wrong, right? So that happens. I think we have those opportunities to do that every day. I mean, this guy could have nodded and smiled and then written me off in his head, but instead he said something that caused me to think and re-examine what I was saying and the way I was thinking, which I'm not necessarily proud of, but I'm happy that he did that, because had he not, I'd still maybe thinking the same things today. And I think that's relevant for everyone.
Last question. Since George Floyd's murder, we've seen a lot of changes, right? And they do feel, or they are very overdue, but we're seeing more and more Confederate statues being removed. NASCAR, they're eliminating the Confederate flags, and we're seeing food products change. Quaker Oats is they're getting rid of Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, Miss Butterworth. Does this feel like a turning point to you?
It feels like a turning point again, because the acknowledgement is there. I don't know. And to me, what's sad is that there needed to be video.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this has been happening for generations. And now, because of the advent of the iPhone, and now we have video of basically our mistreatment over the years by police officers, that people are now believing us. Right. Whereas before it was just, someone's a suspect and therefore a criminal, and they probably had it coming to them. So, again, I think the acknowledgement that there is a problem is the first step. Now, how we go to help resolving that problem is, that's really the difficult, and smarter people than you and I, no offense, David, are going to have to tackle that. I mean, I certainly do have some thoughts on that, and I'd like to, kind of continue working on those and maybe express them one day in a book about how we can start to move forward. But, because it's possible. I mean, I've done it. I shouldn't be, there should be more people that look like me in Northbrook, to be frank. But, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for sacrifices that my parents made, 40 years ago. Just like you wouldn't be here today, David, if it weren't for sacrifices that your parents and your grandparents and their parents made, 40, 50, 100 years ago. So, just the sacrifices for my parents were a little bit different than yours. And I don't think that we had 40 years ago, it was much more difficult for my parents to move into Elmhurst than it should have been. And 50 years ago, it was impossible for my parents to move into Elmhurst. So now I think that if we could start acknowledging that and acknowledging the reasons for it, and make it not necessarily easier, but acknowledge that there's disparity, and then start, looking at education, looking at employment, and providing more opportunity, right? There should not be equality in outcome, right? You cannot guarantee outcomes, but there should be equality in opportunity. Everyone should have the same opportunity. And I think as long as we start moving that in that direction, we're doing what we can in our generation, at least. And we'll find that in generations beyond us, there'll be a lot more opportunity and a lot more equality and opportunity.
Special thanks to Brian for his time and his insights. Next time on Another Day in Pandemic Paradise, I talked to Illinois State Representative Jonathan Carroll on his efforts to pass legislation to stop the bad practices of restraining kids and sending them to quiet rooms in therapeutic schools.
I shared my story of dealing with this when I was a kid. You know, I kind of wanted to put it out there that these are things that I experienced. It kind of led to sort of in a good way, an avalanche of people coming forward and talking about it.
In the meantime, be smart, be safe, and wear your mask.